Welcome to the Useless Hour. Tonight we consider something that does not matter at all, and we are going to take our time about it. There is a hill in Gloucestershire, in the west of England, a short distance outside the city of Gloucester, and rising directly above the village of Brockworth. It is called Cooper's Hill. It is not a famous hill in the way that mountains are famous. It has no notable summit, no monument of consequence, nothing at the top that anyone would climb it in order to see. Its high point stands at something in the region of 287 meters above sea level, which is to say that it is a hill and nothing grander than a hill, one of the wooded shoulders at the western edge of the Cotswolds, where the tidy country stops and the land falls away towards the Severn. On very nearly every day of the year, nothing whatever happens there. There is grass, there are trees, there is the particular damp green quiet that English woodland does better than almost anywhere else. And then, once a year, on a single afternoon at the end of May, several thousand people arrive, and a wheel of cheese is released from the top, and a number of adults throw themselves off the edge after it. That is the event. That is all of it. There is no second act.
The cheese is a Double Gloucester, which is a hard cow's milk cheese of that county, orange gold, close textured, entirely unremarkable in the ordinary course of its life. The wheel used weighs somewhere between 7 and 9 pounds, call it 3 or 4 kilograms, and it is dressed for the occasion in wooden casing and ribbons, which is the only ceremony the cheese receives, and rather more than it strictly requires. It is placed at the lip of the slope. A master of ceremonies counts, in a rhythm the village has kept for longer than anyone present has been alive, and on the count the cheese is let go, and roughly 1 second later the competitors are let go after it.
That 1 second gap is worth dwelling on, because it contains the entire logic of the afternoon. It is offered as a head start, in the manner of a fair race with a fair handicap, and it is nothing of the kind. Nobody has ever needed a head start less. Within a few strides of leaving the top, the wheel has ceased to be a foodstuff in any practical sense, and become a projectile, taking the bumps in the turf and leaving the ground entirely, travelling by the figure that is usually given, and it is a figure that seems to be estimated rather than measured, at something approaching 70 miles an hour by the foot of the slope. No human being has ever run at 70 miles an hour. No human being is going to. The cheese is not caught. The cheese has, by all reliable accounts, never been caught, and the rules quietly accept this. The winner of the race is not the person who catches the cheese, but the first person to cross the line at the bottom, and the cheese is then handed to them afterwards, having beaten them there by a wide margin and with no apparent effort. So the race is not really a race against the cheese. The cheese is a starting pistol that happens to be edible. The reason no one catches it is the gradient, and the gradient is the whole point, and everything else about the day follows from it. The course is about 200 yards, 180 meters, which is nothing, a short walk on level ground, a distance a person crosses without noticing, but it is commonly described as falling at around 1 in 2, a 50% slope, and averages are misleading here in the direction of kindness, because the slope is not uniform. There are stretches near the top that are described by people who have stood on them as near vertical, where the ground simply is not underneath the walker in any useful sense, and the correct way to descend is on the seat of the trousers. There are hollows and shoulders further down, where the surface changes without warning. It is rough pasture on a very steep bank, and it has been worn and reworn by a century and more of people falling down it. What this produces is not running. It is important to be precise about this, because the pictures make it look like running for perhaps a step and a half. What it produces is a controlled fall, and the control is largely notional. The competitor commits at the top, takes 2 or 3 strides that are recognizably strides, and then the hill takes over the arrangement entirely. From that moment, the body is going down whether or not it agrees, and what remains of the competitor's agency is spent on the question of orientation, whether to arrive at the bottom feet first or shoulder first, or turning over and over sideways in a manner that spectators describe as tumbling and participants tend not to describe at all, having no clear memory of it. Some go down in a crouch, hands trailing. Some are airborne. Almost everyone at some point in the descent stops being a person moving down a hill and becomes an object subject to it. At the bottom stand the catchers, who are volunteers, traditionally drawn from the local rugby club, arranged in a line across the runout where the ground finally flattens. Their job is to stop the human beings, since nothing else is going to. They brace and they take the impact, and they absorb people who have arrived at the foot of the slope carrying rather more speed than a body is designed to shed. It is a genuinely useful office, and it is performed with no particular fuss. Beside them wait the ambulance crews and the first aiders, who are also there every year, and who are also not decorative. Because people are hurt, that is not an incidental feature of the day, and it is not a scandal that crept in lately. It is simply what happens, reliably, most years. Broken ankles are the classic injury, and there are accounts from those who have worked at the bottom of feet arriving at angles that feet do not have. Concussion is common. There have been broken legs. In one bad year in the early 1990s, 16 people were reported injured, 4 of them seriously. In a recent running, 6 were taken to hospital. Spectators too are occasionally struck, because a 9-pound wooden-cased wheel travelling at speed does not much distinguish between a competitor and a bystander, and the hill has no shoulder to speak of. And the prize for all this, for the broken ankle and the concussion and the emergency surgery and the missed flight home, is the cheese. Not a cash sum, not a trophy of severe significance. The cheese. That same 7 to 9 pound wheel of Double Gloucester, retrieved from wherever it has come to rest in the hedge and handed over. In commercial terms, it is worth what a good cheese is worth, which is to say the price of a decent dinner and no more. There is no sponsorship purse behind it, there is no ranking, no circuit, no season. There is a hill and a wheel of cheese and a queue of people who have travelled, some of them from other continents, at their own expense, having arranged time off work, for the opportunity to fall 200 yards down a Gloucestershire hillside in front of strangers. You do not need to remember any of this. There will be no test, and the cheese does not require your attention. The oldest written trace of the custom that anyone has firmly identified is a notice in a Worcester newspaper in the summer of 1836, which mentions the event as a thing already going on in the settled tone that newspapers reserve for matters their readers already know about. That is the documentary flaw. It is not the beginning. The tradition is generally held to be older, and how much older is a genuinely open question, with estimates that run to several centuries and evidence that runs to very little. Explanations have been offered. They will keep. What is worth holding on to at the outset is that nobody can say with any confidence why anyone started doing this, and that the not knowing has not slowed it down in the slightest. So, a hill too steep to stand on comfortably, a cheese nobody can catch, a prize worth less than the ambulance that attends it, an origin that no one can account for, and people who come back year after year and go over the edge. Let the shoulders drop, Nothing here needs deciding tonight. The explanations, then. They have been waiting patiently, and they deserve a proper hearing, though it should be said in advance that the hearing does not end in a verdict.
Begin with what actually exists on paper, because it is a very small pile and it is worth handling carefully. The earliest firm written trace of the custom is a message sent to the town crier of Gloucester, an instruction, essentially, of the sort a parish would issue when it wanted something announced aloud in the streets to people who could not be relied upon to read it. The note is a working document. It is not a chronicle, not an antiquarian's account, not anybody's attempt to record a tradition for posterity. It is administration. It announces that the wake at Cooper's Hill is to begin on Whit Monday at 3 o'clock precisely, and that there are cheeses to be run for. And it does so in spelling that wanders considerably from the modern arrangement, in the manner of a man writing quickly for a purpose, rather than for a reader in 2 centuries' time.
The date of that note is where the trouble starts, and it is a good small illustration of how these things go. It is very commonly given as 1826. It is also given in the more carefully sourced accounts as 1836, tied to a publication in a Worcester newspaper on the 9th of June that year. Both dates circulate widely. Both are repeated confidently. They cannot both be right, and the 10-year gap between them has been copied outward from source to source for long enough that the 2 versions now sit side by side in perfectly respectable places, each looking as settled as the other. The honest position is that the earliest secure written evidence for the cheese rolling belongs to the 2nd quarter of the 19th century, that the precise year is muddled in the record, and that nothing very much turns on which of the 2 is correct, because the note itself makes plain that the event was already old news when it was written.
That is the important thing about it, and it is easy to skate past. The message to the crier does not describe a novelty. It does not explain the custom, or justify it, or introduce it. It sets a time and mentions the cheeses in the flat tone of a man arranging something everyone already understands. Whoever wrote it expected to be understood, which means the tradition is older than the paper by some margin that the paper itself cannot measure. And the moment the paper runs out, so does the evidence, and everything before that point is inference, inheritance, and hope. Into that empty space, a great many origins have been poured. The most popular, by a wide margin, is the pagan one. In its usual form, it holds that the rolling of the cheese descends from a pre-Christian rite. That rolling round objects downhill was once a solar act, the wheel standing in for the sun, encouraging it on its way through the turning year, or else a fertility observance meant to wake the ground and secure the harvest. Supporting details are offered. Bundles of burning brushwood, it is said, were rolled down hills to mark the birth of the new year after winter. Buns and biscuits and sweets have been scattered at the top of Cooper's Hill within living memory, and this scattering is widely described as a fertility rite for the fruits of the harvest. The event was, before it moved, held at midsummer, and the rolling of blazing wheels at midsummer is a real and documented practice elsewhere in Europe. The theory is coherent, it is atmospheric, it arrives already dressed for television.
It also deserves rather more skepticism than it usually gets, and the reason is not that it is impossible, but that it is exactly the kind of thing a particular generation of scholars went looking for and found everywhere they looked. The idea that English village customs were the weathered stumps of a lost pre-Christian religion was propounded with enormous energy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by figures of real standing, Edward Tyler, Lawrence Gomme, James Fraser among them, and for a while it carried genuine academic respectability. Under that model, any surviving custom involving fire or greenery or a round object or a hill could be read as a survival, and duly was. By the 1930s, the consensus among historians and anthropologists had turned decisively against it. It was taken apart more thoroughly still by Ronald Hutton, whose survey of the British ritual year put the survival claims under sustained scrutiny and found very nearly all of them wanting. The general finding, put plainly, is that the pagan pedigree of most English calendar customs was not discovered in the evidence. It was supplied to them retrospectively by people who wanted it to be there. You do not need to hold any of this in mind. It will not be asked of you, and the argument will still be unresolved in the morning.
The second explanation is more mundane, and for that reason is repeated less. It holds that the roll was about grazing. Cooper's Hill and the land around it was common land, and rights of common, the right to graze animals on ground you did not own, were the sort of thing that had to be visibly exercised or risked being quietly lost. A public act performed on the hill each year, witnessed by the parish, would constitute a claim. Something happened here, we did it, you saw us do it, the right stands. There are real English customs that worked exactly this way, and the logic is sound. What there is not in this case is a document. No manorial record has been produced showing the cheese roll doing that job, and the theory rests on plausibility rather than proof. It is offered here as the most reasonable of the guesses, and it remains a guess. The third explanation is the least glamorous and possibly the strongest, and it does away with ancient purpose altogether. It observes that the cheese rolling was never a stand-alone rite. It was one item on the programme of a wake, a village gathering at Whitsuntide, held on the hill, of a kind that took place in hundreds of parishes across the country. The folk historian Steve Roud has argued that what survives at Cooper's Hill is the last surviving piece of that wake, which in its day also included wrestling, shin-kicking, gurning, races for smocks, a maypole, and a very considerable quantity of food and drink. On that reading, the cheese was not sacred and not symbolic. It was an attraction, competing for attention with the shin-kicking, and it happened to outlive everything it shared a field with. There is a description from a folklore journal of 1912 which fits that picture rather well, and which is worth having simply because it is a real account rather than a theory about one. It records a master of ceremonies in a brown top hat, wearing a smock over his coat, and a maypole standing on the hill, and wooden discs standing in for cheeses, wrapped in pink paper. That is not the furniture of an ancient mystery. It is the furniture of a village fete, run by somebody's uncle in a borrowed hat in the year before the First World War. Other origins circulate locally and should be named and then set down gently. One holds that a cooper once tested his barrels by rolling them down the hill, which would tidily explain the hill's name and nothing else, and offers no account of how barrels became cheese or why several hundred people would want to chase either. It appears to rest on the name of the hill and on nothing further. The figure of 600 years, which attaches itself to almost every telling, has no evidence behind it that anyone has produced. It is a number that sounds correct, and has been repeated until it sounds sourced. Those who actually run the event have been notably more modest, placing its likely beginnings somewhere in the 16 or 1700s, and declining to be firmer than that. It is worth noting that Cooper's Hill is not unusual in this. The surviving English folk customs almost all carry origin stories considerably more confident than their paperwork. The Haxey Hood in Lincolnshire, with its tale of a noblewoman's lost hood. The Shrovetide football matches, whose beginnings dissolve well before the earliest mention of them. In each case, the custom is genuinely old and genuinely documented from a certain point, and in each case, the story of how it began was assembled later by people who found a bare custom unsatisfying and gave it a reason.
Which leaves the possibility that ought to be taken most seriously of all, and which almost nobody finds satisfying. That some people in a Gloucestershire village, at some point nobody wrote down, rolled a cheese down a hill because the hill was there and the cheese was to hand, and it was a diversion on a holiday afternoon. And that they then did it again the following year and the year after, and that nothing more than habit and enjoyment has ever been required to keep it going. Not everything that has lasted a long time began for a reason. Some things simply began. The hill comes first, because everything that happens here is downstream of the shape of the ground. Cooper's Hill stands on the western edge of the Cotswolds, above the village of Brockworth, on the long limestone escarpment that runs down through Gloucestershire and then simply stops, giving way to the flat country of the Severn Vale. Most English hills subside into their valleys gradually, apologetically, over the course of a mile or two. This one does not. It ends the way a table ends. From the top, the land is gone, and what remains is a green face turned outward to the west, wooded around its shoulders and bare down its middle, with the whole of the vale laid out beyond it like something drawn from an aeroplane.
The summit sits a little over 280 meters above sea level, which by the standards of the Cotswolds is respectable, and by the standards of mountains is nothing whatsoever. That figure, though, describes the hill's place in the world, rather than the drop that concerns anyone racing on it. The raced slope itself is usually given as 200 yards, a shade over 180 meters, measured from the wooden marker at the top to the flat ground and the fence line at the bottom. 200 yards is not a long way. On a running track, it is a distance an unremarkable club athlete covers in well under half a minute, breathing comfortably at the end of it. The times recorded on Cooper's Hill are counted in a small handful of seconds, and it should be said plainly that nobody has ever run them.
The reason is the gradient, and the gradient is really the whole of the story. The figure usually given for the slope is 1 in 2, which is to say that the ground falls a foot for every 2 feet it travels forward, and in places, particularly across the upper third, it is described as being closer to 1 in 1, a face that drops as far as it goes. Sources differ on the precise numbers, as they tend to when the thing being measured is a lumpy field rather than an engineered surface, and it is fair to say only that the average is severe, and the worst of it is severer still. What matters is the practical consequence, which is not in dispute by anyone who has stood there. A person cannot walk down Cooper's Hill in any controlled fashion. Those who go down it on foot outside the race tend to descend at an angle, sideways, digging the edges of their shoes into the turf and taking handfuls of grass as they go, in the manner of somebody getting out of a boat. It is also not a smooth slope, which is a detail easily lost in photographs. A smooth slope of that steepness would at least be predictable. Cooper's Hill is tussocked and rutted and hollowed, scarred by decades of feet and by the ordinary work of rain on a steep field, with soft patches, hard patches, thistles, rabbit scrapes, and a pronounced dip perhaps a third of the way down, where the ground falls away rather faster than the eye has prepared the body to expect.
The surface is broken rather than inclined. It is a slope with events in it. Now the mechanics, which are genuinely interesting and which explain why the footage looks the way it does. Running is a controlled sequence of forward falls, and the control comes from the front foot landing slightly ahead of the body's center of mass. That leading foot is a brake. It arrests, it steadies, it converts a fall into a stride, and it does this several times a second without any conscious thought. Going downhill, the ground drops away beneath each step, so the foot must reach further forward and further down to find it. Steepen the slope enough, and there comes a point where the leg is simply not long enough, where the runner reaches forward for the braking foot and the ground is not there to be reached. On Cooper's Hill, that point arrives within a few strides of the start. After it, no amount of skill or fitness or intention can restore the brake, because the brake was never a matter of strength, it was a matter of geometry, and the geometry has gone. What is left is acceleration. On a slope of 1 in 2, a body is pulled down the line of the hill at roughly 4/10 of the rate at which it would fall through open air, and on the steepest sections, nearer 7/10 of it. That is the entire mechanism. The competitor stops being a person running down a hill and becomes an object undergoing acceleration, and the transition takes about 1.5 seconds. There is a recognizable sequence to it, visible in almost every descent. A few strides of something that resembles running, taken with the torso leaning back and the arms wide. Then a stumble that cannot be recovered, because recovery requires a braking foot. Then the fall, which on that gradient does not end in a landing, because the ground is falling away nearly as fast as the body is. And then the tumble, which continues, gathering, until the hill runs out. The counterintuitive part is that the tumble is very often the safer state. A body fighting to stay upright puts everything through one outstretched limb at a time, an ankle, a knee, a wrist, and asks that single joint to absorb a quantity of energy that is increasing every moment. That is precisely how ankles and collarbones are broken. A body that has given up on staying upright sheds its energy differently, in a long series of small collisions distributed across shoulders, hips, back and thighs, none of which individually amounts to very much. This is why experienced competitors say the same unhelpful-sounding thing to newcomers, which is to relax. A relaxed limb rolls with an impact. A braced limb receives it. The instinct to stiffen is the instinct that does the damage, and it is an instinct, which is what makes the advice so much easier to give than to follow. The upshot is that the hill does not sort people by how fast they can run, since none of them are running. It sorts them by how well they fall, how quickly they can get back to their feet in the 2 or 3 moments when the slope eases enough to allow it, and how little of their momentum they waste on the way. You do not need to remember any of this. It is simply that a race with no running in it turns out to be a race about something else entirely. The cheese has its own physics, and they are not the same physics at all. A dense wheel, released at the top with roughly a second's head start, has a considerable advantage over any human body, because it is small, heavy, round, and entirely uninterested in remaining upright. Figures of around 70 miles an hour are commonly quoted for it, sometimes 80, and it should be admitted that nobody has ever stood at the bottom with a radar gun to settle the matter. It is a hill, not a laboratory, and the number is best taken as an indication of order rather than a measurement. What is certain is that the cheese leaves the ground. On a broken surface, a rolling wheel does not stay rolling. It strikes a rut, lifts, travels through the air, lands, deflects, and lifts again.
so that its path down the hill is a series of unrelated bounces rather than a line. This is why the cheese is genuinely dangerous to spectators, and why a wheel has on occasion left the course entirely and struck someone standing along the side. It is also why the race is not, in any meaningful sense, a chase. The cheese is not caught. It has never really been caught. It arrives at the bottom well ahead of everybody, and the winner is simply the first human body to arrive after it. All of which imposes certain practical arrangements at the foot of the hill, arranged by long habit rather than by design. Volunteers from the local rugby club, along with young farmers and other willing bodies, station themselves across the flat ground at the bottom, standing in a loose line and taking hold of competitors as they arrive. This is not ceremony. A person who has been accelerating for 200 yards does not stop because the ground has leveled, and beyond the catchers lie a fence, a lane, and a great many photographers. The catchers absorb what arrives, and are frequently knocked flat doing it.
Behind them sits the medical provision, which has varied over the years. St. John Ambulance covered the event for a long period and withdrew in 2012 when the hill ceased to be formally managed, and since then ambulances have waited in the narrow lane below while first aiders work at the bottom of the slope. In some years the air ambulance has been called. Casualties who cannot walk have to be carried off a hillside on which nobody can walk, which is its own slow and awkward operation, conducted sideways with handfuls of grass. All of which brings the attention finally to the object itself, which has been sitting quietly at the center of this account for some time now, without being properly looked at. It is easy to treat the cheese as a detail. It is the thing that gets released and then vanishes, and the cameras follow the people. But the cheese is not a prop, and it is not a novelty item manufactured for the purpose. It is a real cheese, of a real and rather old kind, made by real people who make it for a living, and who sell the rest of the week's production to shops and market stalls, and customers who eat it with bread. On the afternoon in question, one wheel out of an ordinary run of wheels is set aside, dressed and destroyed.
Double Gloucester is a hard cow's milk cheese belonging, as the name says, to the county of Gloucestershire, and it has been made there in some form for several hundred years. It is the older and richer of a pair. Its companion, Single Gloucester, is the thinner, paler cheese, lower in fat, more crumbly, lighter in the mouth, matured for a shorter time, and historically the cheese the farmhouse kept for itself. Double Gloucester was the cheese that went to market. The distinction between the two is one of those things that sounds precise and turns out on inspection to be a small argument that has never been entirely settled. The most commonly given account is that Single was made from a mixture of milks, the previous evenings having had its cream skimmed off, while Double was made from the fuller, richer milk of a single milking at the height of the season, and made in a deeper mould, so that the finished wheel stood roughly twice the depth of its lesser sibling. Others hold that the doubling refers only to size, or only to cream, or only to the fact that it was pressed harder and kept longer. It is possible that all of these were true in different valleys at different times. Cheese naming was not, historically, a regulated science. What matters is what the doubling produced. The richer milk and the drier, more worked curd, handled in a manner not far from the way cheddar is handled a little south, gave a cheese that was firm, close in texture, and slow to spoil. It was matured for months rather than weeks. It travelled. A wheel of Double Gloucester could be put on a cart and taken somewhere, and still be a cheese when it arrived, which is the entire commercial point of a hard cheese, and the reason hard cheeses exist at all.
Both cheeses were originally made from the milk of the Gloucester cow, an old breed of the Severn Vale, dark brown with a white line running along the spine and down the tail, whose milk carried small fat globules and a high proportion of protein, and which cheesemakers valued for precisely that reason. The breed very nearly disappeared. Cattle plague and the steady commercial preference for animals that simply gave more milk reduced it by the middle of the 20th century to a handful of herds, and by the early 1970s to a population that could be counted in the dozens. Farmhouse Gloucester cheesemaking had died out in the 1950s altogether. It was revived from something close to nothing by a small number of people who took the trouble, most notably by Charles Martel, who began making single Gloucester again in the early 1970s, partly as a way of giving the surviving cattle a purpose. Single Gloucester now holds a protected designation, which means that it may be made only in Gloucestershire on farms that keep Gloucester cows. Double Gloucester carries no such protection and is made widely, which is why most of the orange blocks sold under the name have no connection to the county at all.
The colour is worth a moment. Double Gloucester is orange, sometimes distinctly so, and nothing in the milk makes it that way. The colour comes from annatto, a dye extracted from the seeds of a tropical shrub added to the vat. Older colouring were used before it. Carrot juice and the yellow-flowered hedgerow plant known as lady's bedstraw are both mentioned in the accounts. The reason is not culinary, it is commercial. From the 18th century onwards, cheese merchants encouraged makers to colour their cheeses, so that a distinctive Gloucester could be told apart on a stall from all the other pale wheels beside it, and so that a rich golden appearance could be maintained through the winter months when the milk itself went paler. It is, in other words, branding, several centuries before the word existed. You do not need to remember any of this, but the density is the part that matters on the hill, and it is a genuine and unglamorous piece of physics. A soft cheese cannot be rolled down anything. It would flatten, split and stop. A hard, well-pressed, months-matured Double Gloucester is a solid cylinder of consistent material with a natural rind, and it behaves, when released down a steep slope, very much as a wheel behaves. It holds its shape, it holds its line, more or less. It keeps its mass concentrated and its edge intact. The traditional round form, which exists because that is the shape a cheese takes when it is pressed in a hoop and turned in a store, happens also to be the shape that rolls. Nobody designed a cheese for this. The requirements of preserving milk for the winter and the requirements of descending a 1:2 gradient at speed simply turned out by accident to coincide. The wheel used is a full one of the ordinary size, and the figure usually quoted for its weight is somewhere between 7 and 9 pounds, roughly 3 to 4 kilograms. 7 pounds and 8 pounds are both given in different reports, often for the same year, and the honest position is that the exact figure varies a little, and that nobody has ever considered it important enough to record with precision. For most of the modern history of the event, that wheel came from one family. Diana Smart began making cheese in Gloucestershire in the 1980s, at the age of about 60, at Old Leigh Court, the farm she and her husband had taken on decades earlier. It began, by her own account, as a retirement project, which it comprehensively failed to remain. She built a cheese house, took over an existing local cheese business, and set about making Double Gloucester and Single Gloucester in the traditional way, from raw milk. In 1994, the farm bought Gloucester cattle of its own in order to keep the protected cheese and the endangered breed alive together.
each propping up the other. From 1988 onwards, she supplied the wheel for the cheese rolling and went on doing so year after year for a quarter of a century. Then, in May 2013, she was warned by the police. The warning was not directed at her alone. A police inspector spoke to those understood to be involved in organizing the event and advised them that anyone who facilitated it might be treated as an organizer and could therefore be held responsible for injuries sustained on the hill. The Cheesemaker was, at that point, 86 years old. Her contribution to the proceedings consisted of making a cheese and handing it over. She withdrew, saying, in substance, that she could not afford the risk, a remark that carries rather more weight coming from a working farm than it would from anywhere else.
So, in 2013, the hill ran without a cheese. A lightweight foam replica was used instead. The correct diameter, the correct colors, none of the mass. It went down the slope, and people went after it, and someone reached the bottom first, and a real Double Gloucester, made as it happens by the same cheesemaker, was presented to the winner afterwards, away from the hill, having taken no part in the race it was the reason for. This is a strange thing to sit with, and it is worth sitting with. The ritual proved perfectly capable of running without the object at its center. The chase was unaffected, the crowd was unaffected, the winner still went home with a cheese. What the foam year demonstrated, without meaning to, is that the cheese is not really the point of the cheese rolling, and never has been. The descent is the point, and the wheel is only the excuse that gets everyone to the edge. And yet nobody was satisfied. The following year, the real cheese returned, the cheesemaker observing simply that she had heard nothing further from the police and had made one. Diana Smart died in 2021, in her 90s, and the work continued in the family, with her son Rod, who had taken over the making, and his wife Jo, carrying it on at the same farm, on the same hill-facing ground, for the same afternoon in May.
And so the hill acquires, over the decades, something no one ever intended it to have, which is a competitive record. There are names attached to it now, and dates, and tallies, and the tallies are kept with the same seriousness that any sport keeps its tallies, which is to say entirely, and without any apparent awareness that the object being pursued is a cheese. The name that sits at the top of that record is Chris Anderson, a man from Brockworth itself, which is to say from the village at the foot of the very hill in question, and a former soldier of the British Army. He first won in 2005 when he was 17 years old, and he did not stop. He went on winning, race after race and year after year, until by the time of his final appearance in 2022, he had accumulated 23 victories, a figure recognized by Guinness World Records as the most wins of a cheese rolling race by any person who has ever lived. Before him, the record had belonged to Stephen Guide, who won 21 times across the years from 1976 to 1991, and Anderson drew level with that mark in 2018, before going one clear later the same afternoon. Stephen Brain, another Gloucestershire man, is credited with 17 wins, spread between 1984 and the year 2000. Various tallies circulate for the lesser records, and accounts for men such as Craig Brown, who took races in the early 2000s, differ depending on which list is consulted, so it is safer to say only that he won more than once and leave the arithmetic where it lies.
Anderson has spoken plainly about what the hill took in exchange. Over his years of winning, he collected a broken ankle, a severe concussion, and bruised kidneys. and in one of his later victories he tore a calf muscle on the way down and won anyway. He retired after his 23rd win, at which point he was, in the ordinary sense of the word, a champion, and had for his trouble a great many rounds of Double Gloucester, and a permanent record in a book of world records that also contains the longest fingernails. The women's race has its own line of descent. Flo Early from Stroud holds the female record with 4 wins, taken in 2000 and then again in 2016, 2018 and 2019, and she too has been recognized formally for it. She carries a visible reminder of the hill on her body, a collarbone broken on the slope, healed in such a way that her right shoulder is permanently altered in shape, a protrusion she has spoken about openly. It is not a wound she seems to regard as a tragedy. It is simply what the hill did, and it is still there. More recently, the women's race has been won by people who did not grow up anywhere near Gloucestershire. Abby Lamp, an American and a graduate of North Carolina State University, won in 2022, becoming the first American woman to carry the cheese away, and then won again in 2024. And in 2023, the race was won by Delaney Irving, a 19-year-old Canadian from Nanaimo in British Columbia, who was in the United Kingdom on a backpacking trip and decided, more or less on the spur of the moment, to take part. What happened to her on the way down is the detail that explains the whole event better than any other single fact about it. Somewhere on the descent, she struck her head. She has since said that she remembers hitting it and remembers that it hurt, and then remembers nothing until she woke up in the medical tent at the bottom of the hill. She crossed the finish line unconscious. She did not know that she had won until somebody in the tent told her sometime afterwards that she had. She had beaten every other competitor down a hill in a county she had never lived in a race she had joined on impulse, and she had been insensible at the moment of victory, and the news of it had to be delivered to her as though it were a piece of unrelated information about somebody else. You do not need to remember any of this. It is enough to hold the shape of it. A young woman waking in a tent and being told she had won. The international element is no longer an occasional novelty. Kenny Rackers became the first winner from North America in 2013. In 2022, Robert Gabriels became the first winner from continental Europe, and Amr El Shorbati the first winner from Africa. In the years since, the German competitor Tom Kopke has won repeatedly, taking the opening men's race 3 years running, and by the most recent running of the event, every men's downhill race was won by a competitor who was not British, with the winners coming from Germany, the Netherlands, and the United States. People now fly thousands of miles, book accommodation, arrange time off work, and cross oceans in order to fall down a field in Gloucestershire, and they arrive with training regimes and strategies, and are considered on whether it is better to run or to surrender to gravity early. The crowd has grown to match. The hill sits in open countryside, with narrow lanes leading to it, and no gates, no tickets, and no seating, and it can accommodate, by the estimates that have been made, something in the region of 5,000 people. In 2009, roughly 15,000 arrived, which is to say 3 times what the site could hold, standing on a steep slope beside a race in which heavy objects and human bodies travel downhill at speed and cannot be steered. The cost of all this is recorded year by year in the language of ambulance services. The injuries are rarely exotic. They are sprains, dislocated shoulders, broken ankles, broken collarbones, broken wrists, and concussions,
the ordinary catalogue of what happens when a body tumbles a long way over uneven ground scattered with loose stones, tree roots and nettles. In 1993, around 15 people were hurt, 4 of them seriously. In 1997, the figure reached 33 treated, and some accounts put the total higher still, at around 37, of whom 7 were spectators rather than racers. One person that year, trying to get out of the path of a cheese travelling downhill, fell some 100 feet and was taken to hospital with head injuries. The following year, 2 of the races were cancelled on safety grounds.
That the cheese itself injures bystanders is not folklore. A wheel of that weight, released down a slope of that steepness, reaches a speed at which it can knock a standing adult off his feet, and it does not always stay on the intended line. Spectators have been struck. It is one of the few sporting events in which the trophy is also a hazard to the audience. The provision at the bottom of the hill has become a fixture in its own right. Volunteers from local rugby clubs and from the young farmers stand across the base of the slope as catchers, whose job is to arrest the momentum of people who arrive at the bottom no longer in control of their own bodies, and to carry those who need it to the first aid area. Ambulance crews are stationed there as a matter of course. St. John Ambulance provided the first aid cover for many years and withdrew in 2012 when the event ceased to be officially managed. In more recent years, the ambulance service has attended with land ambulances, an air ambulance, an operations officer, a doctor, a first responder, and a hazardous area response team, the sort of assembly ordinarily reserved for an incident rather than an amusement. In 2023, 6 competitors were taken to hospital by ambulance. There is no record of anyone having been killed on the hill, which is remarkable, and which is also the kind of statement that is only ever made about activities where the possibility has been genuinely considered.
And still they come. They plan their years around a single afternoon in late May. They cross continents for it. They train for a descent that lasts a matter of seconds and which most of them will not remain upright for. They accept, in advance and with clear eyes, that they may go home with a bone broken in a way that will still be visible in the shape of their shoulder 30 years later, and the prize at the end of it, the object that justifies the ambulances and the catchers and the flights and the fractures, is a wheel of Double Gloucester cheese, which any of them could have bought intact and undamaged from a shop. The trouble, when it finally arrived in a form that could not be waved away, did not arrive as an injury. It arrived as a number. In 2009, something in the order of 15,000 people came to Cooper's Hill, on a site that those responsible for it reckoned could hold around 5,000. The lanes around Brockworth are lanes. They were built for the traffic of a village on the edge of the escarpment, and not for the traffic of a small festival, and they filled, and then they stopped, and the queues stood still in the hedgerows for hours. Nobody had sold a ticket, nobody had counted anyone in. The crowd had simply come because it had heard, and because the hill is a public place with a footpath running up it and no gate at the bottom to be closed.
And so, early in 2010, the committee that had for years quietly arranged the thing, the marshals, the master of ceremonies, the ambulance cover, the rope at the top, all the small apparatus that a village provides for itself and does not think of as apparatus, announced that the official event would not take place. The reasons given were the reasons that were true, that the numbers could no longer be managed safely, that the site could not absorb them, and that the costs and the liabilities of standing behind such a gathering had passed beyond what a handful of local people could reasonably shoulder. It was reported around the world in the tone the world reserves for such reports,
as the end of the cheese rolling. It was not the end of the cheese rolling. On the appointed afternoon of that same spring, people walked up Cooper's Hill anyway. Not many by the standards of the year before, the figure usually given is around 100, but enough, and enough who were willing to run. A cheese went down the hill. Somebody went after it. No permission had been sought because there was no one from whom permission could be sought, and no permission had been granted because there was no one to grant it. The hill was there. It had been there the previous year, and it was there still. And the essential discovery of 2010, which the following decade and a half has only confirmed, is that a hill cannot be cancelled. An event can be cancelled, a committee can dissolve itself, a booking can lapse, an insurance policy can be declined. None of these things closes a slope of common ground in Gloucestershire on a Monday in May.
There was one serious attempt to put the thing back inside the ordinary machinery of modern events, and it is worth setting out plainly because of how it went. For 2011, a new arrangement was proposed, a 2-day festival, properly stewarded, properly planned, with the crowd capped at a number the site could take, and admission by ticket at £20. This is, by any reasonable standard, exactly what a responsible organiser is supposed to do. It is the answer that event law, insurance, and the whole apparatus of public safety would give if asked. The village's response was not gratitude. The committee was accused of profiteering. Its members reported abuse in the street and in the shops, hostility at the school gates, threats made against them personally and against their homes. In March of that year, the proposed festival was called off, not on safety grounds, but because the people who had volunteered to organise it were no longer willing to be the people who organised it. And on the day, once again, a crowd walked up the hill and rolled a cheese down it. Perhaps 200 that time. No tickets, no committee, no one to abuse. What has followed every year since is an event with no organiser at all. That phrase is used loosely in ordinary speech, and it is not loose here. It is the precise legal situation. There is no body that convenes it, no name on a form, no application to any authority, no safety plan submitted, no traffic management scheme, no public liability cover, because there is no entity to insure. Thousands attend. Nobody runs it. The consequences of this are not merely paperwork. When the official event ended, so did the arrangements that had come with it. St. John Ambulance, which had provided first aid cover, stood down in 2012 when the event lost its official standing, and later years have depended on such medical volunteers as choose to be present. The Safety Advisory Group for the Borough of Tewkesbury, which is the multi-agency body where a council and the emergency services would normally sit down with an organiser and work through the plan, has for years issued statements before the day setting out that it has received nothing to work with. The documentation detailing how the public will be kept safe has not been submitted because there is nobody to submit it. Its stated worry has consistently been the same one, and it is not about a man with a broken ankle. It is about what would happen in a major incident with many casualties at once, on a slope where ambulances have in the past struggled to reach the site for a prolonged period, with the resources of the county's police, ambulance and fire services drawn to a field they were not asked to attend. And here the whole thing arrives at a genuine oddity, which deserves to be stated without any smiling at all. The levers a modern authority holds over a gathering are levers that grip an organiser. A license is refused to somebody. A safety notice is served on somebody. A prosecution requires a defendant. Insurance requires a policyholder. And liability requires a party who assumed it. Remove the organiser, and every one of those instruments closes on nothing. The gathering has no license, and therefore cannot have one taken away. It has no insurance, and therefore cannot lose it. It has no permission, and therefore cannot have permission withdrawn. What remains to the authorities is discouragement, statements, warnings, appeals to attend elsewhere or not at all. And the record shows that the local authority and Gloucestershire's police have, on the whole, chosen to manage the day rather than attempt to forbid it, while making clear, in the careful language such statements use, that anyone going should think hard about the risk they are choosing.
The one place where the levers can still find purchase is on individuals, and that is where they were tried. The reasoning is straightforward and, in law, not unsound. If a person supplies, arranges, marshals, or otherwise brings the thing into being, that person may have made themselves the organizer, and an organizer is answerable. So, in 2013, a police inspector put that proposition to those who appeared to be involved in planning the day, and it was put also to the woman who made the cheese, a local cheesemaker, then 86 years old, who had supplied the wheel for a quarter of a century, and who described the visit to her farm as heavy-handed and the manner of it as threatening. She was told, as she understood it, that she could be held responsible for injuries sustained by people running down a hill after her cheese. The immediate result was that the wheel used that year was a lightweight foam replica. A real Double Gloucester returned the following season, and she made it. You do not need to remember any of this. It will still have happened in the morning.
Approaches of a similar kind were reported to volunteers and to others who looked from the outside, like the people in charge. Their effect was not to stop the event. Their effect was to confirm the shape it had already taken, because the lesson everyone drew was the obvious one. To be visibly responsible for the cheese rolling is to acquire a liability that no individual can carry, and therefore nobody will be visibly responsible for it. Ideas surfaced from time to time of formalizing it again, of ticketing it, of moving it to flatter ground, where a crowd could be held and an ambulance could drive, and none of them found anyone willing to own them. The hill is the point, and the hill is where it is. So the arrangement settled into its present form, which is that on one afternoon a year, several thousand people converge on a slope in Gloucestershire for an event that, in the eyes of the law and of every agency concerned, does not officially exist and has no author. Which leaves the question of why it is still there at all, and the answer turns out to be stranger and simpler than any of the arguments made for or against it. For most of its recorded life, the cheese rolling was a local matter. It belonged to Brockworth and to the parishes around it, and the crowd on the bank was drawn from a few miles of Gloucestershire in every direction. What changed was not the hill and not the cheese. What changed was that the falling became watchable at a distance. The event has an unusual property as footage. It requires no commentary, no context, and no knowledge of the place, because a person tumbling 400 feet down a slope after a wheel of cheese explains itself in about 2 seconds in any language on earth. Television found it first, and then the internet found it properly, and once a thing of that shape is loose on the internet, it does not come back. By the time anyone thought to ask whether this was a good idea, the hill had an audience of millions of people who would never stand on it. The consequences arrived in the ordinary way. Winners of the various races have come from Australia, Belgium, Canada, Egypt, Germany, Japan, New Zealand, and the United States. A Netflix series in 2020 devoted an episode to it and followed one of its long-standing competitors through her preparations. The Royal Mail put it on a postage stamp in 2019 in a set given over to the more curious British Customs, which is a form of official recognition that costs the state nothing and commits it to nothing.
And every year now, a certain number of people book flights to England, travel to a field outside Gloucester, and throw themselves down a hill for a cheese they will mostly give away.
There is a real tension in that, and it is worth naming without resolving it. A custom that exists because a particular village has always done it in a particular field is not obviously improved by the arrival of the world. The people who live at the bottom of Cooper's Hill did not ask for the traffic, the parking, the volume, or the strangers on the lane at 7 in the morning on a bank holiday. Something that once was a village afternoon is now, for one day a year, an international sporting fixture that no one has agreed to host. And yet the visitors are not tourists in the usual sense, because there is nothing to buy and nothing to see except each other. They have come a very long way in order to participate in something that offers them no reward beyond the participation, which is a category of traveller that most places never encounter. In the most recent years, the international arrivals have simply taken the thing over. A German competitor won the men's race 3 times in succession. In 2026, a 21-year-old Dutchman won it for the first time for the Netherlands, and every one of the men's downhill races that afternoon was won by someone who had come from abroad to be there, which had never happened before in the recorded history of the hill.
What is genuinely remarkable is that it survived at all, because comparable customs mostly did not. The 19th century in Britain was a great tidying, and it was extremely effective. Street football on Shrove Tuesday, played in dozens of towns for centuries, was largely swept off the roads after the Highway Act of 1835 made it an offence to play on the public highway. The bull running at Stamford in Lincolnshire, which had run on the 13th of November for something like 600 years, was worn down by law and by dragoons and by public opinion until the last one was held in 1839, and it never came back. The Cotswold Olympic Games on Dover's Hill, a short drive from Brockworth, simply ended in 1852, when the common land they were held on was enclosed and divided between its owners, and lay dormant for over a century before anyone revived them. That is how these things usually go. They are not usually banned in a dramatic sense. They are legislated around, or enclosed, or insured out of reach, or handed to a committee that decides, reasonably and with regret, that it can no longer be responsible. Cooper's Hill has proved unusually difficult to end, and the reason is almost embarrassing in its simplicity. The crowd that overwhelmed it, the cancellation, the committee that dissolved rather than carry on, all of that is behind us now, and what it left behind is the interesting part. There is no committee, no admission charge, no sponsor, no funding, no governing body, and nobody whose signature would be required to stop it. There is no organization to abolish. There is only a date, a hill, a cheese, and the fact that people keep arriving. This is the thing the modern world finds hardest to deal with, and it is worth saying plainly and then letting go of. The instinct of every institution is to make a thing safe, legible, and sponsored, to give it a structure, a risk assessment, a brand partner, a set of accounts, and a person who is accountable. The cheese rolling has resisted all of that, and it has not resisted by fighting. It has no position, no campaign, and nothing to say for itself. It has simply declined to acquire the parts that could be regulated. You cannot revoke a license that was never issued. You cannot defund something with no funding. You cannot disband a committee that dissolved 16 years ago. What remains is a custom reduced to its absolute minimum, which turns out to be the most durable form it could possibly take. A few thousand people who have decided, without consulting anyone, to be in a particular field
on a particular afternoon.
And so it stands as one of the last things in Britain that happens purely because it has always happened. Not for money, because there is none. Not for glory, because the world's press will name the winner for a day and forget them by Wednesday. Not for the cheese, which is worth a few pounds and is often eaten by a household that had no part in winning it. It happens because the date comes round and people go up the hill, and this is the whole mechanism, and there is no deeper layer underneath it to discover. Which is why a man who flies in from another continent to fall down a Gloucestershire hillside is not behaving irrationally, or not only that, he is doing something a great deal older than the reasons anyone could give him for it. Human beings have been gathering at a fixed place on a fixed day to do a fixed and useless thing for as long as there have been fixed days, and the doing has always come first. The explanations were fitted afterwards by people who were not there, and the explanations have mostly worn away while the doing has not. The absence of a reason is not a defect in the custom. It is very close to being the point of it. A thing done for a reason ends when the reason does. A thing done for no reason at all has nothing that can expire. None of which needs to be settled tonight, or indeed at all.
Somewhere west of here, the hill is standing in the dark, as it does for 364 days of the year, with nothing happening on it. The grass is growing back over the ruts. The trees at the top are doing what trees do. Next May, the date will come round again, and nobody will have organised anything, and the cheese will be let go, and the hill will do the rest. You do not need to remember any of this. Not the hill, not the gradient, not the weight of the cheese, not the names of any of the people who went down after it. It will all be gone by morning, which is exactly right, because it was never information you needed. It was only somewhere quiet to put your attention while you stopped. The cheese is already at the bottom. It has been for some time. Sleep well, and when you next find yourself wanting to forget, just for an hour, everything that actually matters, the useless hour will be waiting. Good night.